All right, so Eric, I was able to finish your book. I really enjoyed it, and I wanted to ask you a couple questions about it, and questions about the content of the book, but then also sort of about your process and about how you kind of were able to compile such a very attractive book. For those who I'll have it linked somewhere, but here is the book, If These Fists Could Talk. Um, and I'll also link some information about Eric so that you can read up on him. Very interesting guy. So the questions I have for you, well, actually, why don't we just start with ROBA, because this whole book sort of revolves around that concept, and it's a concept that you coined. So why don't you just quickly explain it so we can kind of, hover around that concept for a little while.
Okay. Well, ROBA stands for reciprocal object-based aggression, and ROBA is kind of my theory of everything regarding what the human condition is, I guess. And the reason I zero in on reciprocal object-based aggression is because I'm an action designer and stuntman by trade, a fight choreographer, and a lot of my job is designing action scenes between a good guy and a bad guy, and I have to kind of take both of their sides. And if for some reason, um, if I'm not able to understand the intention behind violence, the intention behind evil, then I can't really make a good action scene. And so for my entire career, I've sort of had this perspective on people and on violence, which is like a little bit, maybe a little bit more objective and not very emotional. And that might have come before doing this. I just have never been very emotional about violence. Some might think that's a flaw. Maybe it's a feature. I don't know. And and so as I hear so many people speak in the mainstream, in the sciences, they talk about, humans as though we're just animals. I hear this a lot. I understand what they mean by that. But when usually couched within that sentiment is this idea that like everything that humans do is just like a degree of difference from what animals do. And so they cite, for example, human language is just animal communication. It's complicated communication, right? Human kinship and family is just animal reproduction, right? They sort of draw this evolutionary line. Even religion, they'll say, human religion is just animal ritual. So geese have rituals when they go and they have mating rituals and all this, right? So what they do is they draw these kind of lines from, animal to human and try and trace. It's kind of this mental exercise that they do where they'll trace, like bird calls until that evolved into human music, right?
Sure.
And this is just, and I've just never quite like followed this line of thinking because it's such a huge leap of, in my opinion, faith to go between those two things. But I can kind of see their reasoning. And in the process, what they end up doing inevitably is that, every human institution always begins then, if it's somewhere in between animal and human, right? If it's somewhere on that line, then every human institution starts out like having a utility first and foremost, and then it sort of becomes religious later, right? And it becomes religious so that we can kind of understand the world. And then, like, around 1850, it goes back to being utilitarian again, right? And then we like
Hmm.
write ourselves again with Darwin. And I just find that to be a little bit cynical, right? Like this idea that, well, that maybe that's beyond the point, but the issue is that it's very difficult to make a case against that perspective because, if you have a more sort of sacred idea of language or a more sacred idea of music, I feel like you're just kind of speaking a different language. And you can't really argue against this, right? You can sort of just like you can kind of come up with a different origin story, and then you're not really speaking the same language. But the one thing that always puzzled me was that they would equate animal aggression with human aggression. And they tried to draw this, again, it's an evolutionary line from animals to humans. And I always thought, like in the back of my mind, like that the human violence can't possibly be like animal combat. It can't be anything like it because we're the only ones on this planet that could wipe ourselves out. As far as I know, there's no animal species whose combat is so deadly that they could wipe themselves out. Like, let alone even two two animals just clashing, right? And when I talk about combat, I mean, kind on kind. So not hunting, but a buck fighting a buck or a chimp fighting a chimp, right? And these are wars of dominance or these combat of dominance. And like ultimately, animal combat is actually a very stable system. Zookeepers are always reminded not to interfere with this stuff, right? Like in chimpanzee exhibits, for example, when the a new employee goes in to work at a chimpanzee exhibit, they have to be reminded not to step in and defend the poor hapless chimp because that's just not how they work. And the hapless chimp is not going to die.
Hmm.
And that's the thing about humans is that as soon as we see fists flying, we start to think like, oh no, what's next? Like, is a rock going to be thrown? Are they going to grab a gun? Is that going to turn into a war? Is that going to turn into a nuclear war? Right? We just kind of like extrapolate to infinity, like inevitably. And so humans are incredibly averse to violence in general because we see this infinite potential apocalyptic threat. But animals
Hmm.
don't have this. So like what exactly is that difference? And so I went looking for what exactly like the mechanical difference is between animal combat and human combat. And it's actually extremely simple. It's that humans can use objects within combat in a reciprocal way and animals can't. And even the smartest chimpanzee in the world can't and doesn't really use any objects in combat. They might wave a stick around, they might throw a rock, but that's always for intimidation. And no other chimpanzees really anticipate that that's going to be an issue anyway. It's never a hard blow. There's no improvement in technique. And then the other chimps don't gang up and start throwing stones too. It just doesn't happen because if that did
Right.
happen, then you would have rock wars, and those don't happen. And in fact, we kind of have this weird Mandela effect with animal combat as well, where we seem to remember chimpanzees having weapons, and that's actually never happened. There's one or two instances of a chimp throwing a rock in a book,
Hmm.
and there's no proof that it really did anything. And this is sort of the foundation of like this Planet of the Apes fantasy that chimps are like just on the cusp of being humans. We just can't let them have weapons. And if that were true, then they would have rock wars. So ROBA to me was this like very clear difference. Like, okay, humans have this, animals don't. And if there is some kind of path between the two, it's not really up to me to find what that is. They can find it, but I don't have to find it. All I have to do is point out the difference.
Right.
And so it was really
Yeah.
just like putting my finger on that, and I started from there.
Yeah. Well, since I, read the book and kind of got the terminology that you were using and kind of saw things through that scope, it was very easy to sort of see how it plays out even in really mundane things. Um, you don't realize how often you adapt your posturing, your words even, to prevent some projected unlikely event from happening. So like, just as like as an example, if you've got a friend or a family member that's kind of like a little loose cannon type person, you might have something that you want to say to them, and you're like, oh, I don't want to say that because this person's gonna grab a gun and is gonna kill me in my sleep, like something like that you just don't even take certain routes because there's a possibility that it could go in that direction.
Yeah.
And I think that's very interesting. And it's also interesting to think about in the context of um, in the context of art and story because you see it everywhere. Like a lot of stories are predicated on this idea that we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know what this other's guy is going to do, so I have to be ready for that. And how you kind of explain it in the book that it becomes like an arms race. I'm concerned that you're going to come at me with a knife, so I got to prepare with something bigger. And what that inevitably does is I think it has maybe two possible trajectories. Either it defuses or it escalates to the point where someone dies, basically.
Hmm. Yeah, the animals can't exactly predict what the opponent's going to do either, but they have a pretty good idea. Now, of course, there's still, practically limitless options for what kind of attack a buck is going to do, but a buck's antlers are going to kind of determine what movement it's going to do. They're sort of designed for combat so that bucks don't die. It's very interesting. And one buck can look at the other buck and kind of know, that antler's broken. They'll make a quick decision, and then combat's very quick as a result. But with humans, we can't even do that. Um, in fact, we're thinking about it before we even leave the house. We're thinking about it years before anything happens. It's almost like we're constantly in the combat loop, and I don't think animals are
Mm.
constantly in a combat loop. I think a lot of the time they're not thinking about it. It's not there. With humans, it's like always there. Or, like you said, it's sort of being transferred into something else. And what's different about us is that, because any object could be the object of combat, it sort of like fractalizes the fractals. It's like you can't even begin to predict what somebody's going to do. And so, whereas animals are pretty like uh, prone or pretty like inclined to enter into combat, humans are like overwhelmingly disinclined from entering combat. Overwhelmingly. How many fights did you see today? I mean,
Yeah.
if you're not on Instagram, but just looking outside,
Right.
like, right, you go to the
Yeah.
bank, like, people aren't fighting over the money usually. Of course, news media will skew this. That's why it's like important not to use that as a gauge for your daily life, right?
Mm.
But in general, humans are like overwhelmingly averse to any kind of conflict, and we do so many things instead of it. And that includes, everything from talking to, religious ritual to construction, machines. I think a lot of these things sort of contain all that stuff as well. I think it's all kind of the same stuff that's bottled up in various different formula. And really all we're trying to do is just like not let violence break out because it's infinitely catastrophic. And interestingly, the more we bottle up violence into machines and into nuclear technologies that were originally for peace,
Mm.
then like those technologies are like ripe and ready to be co-opted by violence again.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I mean, it's interesting to think like any, so for like a functioning society, anyone who wants to kind of go that route, the route of violence and the route of power, overt exercises of violence. Ideally, like the society is going to stop that. Police are going to come with bigger guns, and if they can't do it, someone else is going to come with even bigger guns, and eventually you're going to die. Think school shooters or
Right,
whatever.
right.
Like it's gonna end, and I think that the inverse of that, maybe something like Myanmar or Haiti or something like that, where there is no one to fix the problem. The biggest guns are out, and they just keep shooting. Is sort of like a litmus test of a livable society. Like
Mm.
you're really preventing anything from happening by the fact that like violence can go unchecked. And I think when you mentioned that violence is one of these like really foundational elements of our human experience, and it sort of like bubbles under the surface of even what we understand ourselves to be. And there are probably a couple of others. You mentioned language, and one of the things that you do is you connect those two in the book, violence as a language. Do you mind sort of extrapolating on that?
Yeah, well, you mentioned that Myanmar and Haiti as examples of like unchecked violence. I also wonder what that violence would look like if it weren't for mass media. I don't know how much of it is a show. I don't know how much of the protests are a show. The Arab Spring, all the signs are in English. I think that, media has just this like, it's just a third party in every conflict now. Um, and so if you look back at, wartime societies like during the Iron Age, now there's this interesting book. It's called The Alphabet and the Goddess by Leonard Shlain, and also The Chalice and the Blade by Riane Eisler. And these books are like they're these sort of like feminist critiques of violence that look at art history and they compare. kind of like these, they would argue more egalitarian and less less warlike societies. They compare their art to, say, Byzantine art, Babylonian art, is Israelite art, whatever that is, doesn't exist almost, like
Mm.
Islamic art basically doesn't exist. It's all calligraphy. And their takeaway is that the more war you have, like the less less art you have, right? And that's true to some extent. I don't agree with their idea of like how that starts, but that's a different conversation. But what I would say, just as a caveat to that, is that war is just its own language. Like you said, like violence is its own language, because every tactic and every campaign is a story, and it all has like a very religious context. Like all violence is extremely religious. It's like if you want to see some of the most religious writing, find this book. It's called Madmen's Manifestos, and it's all these like manifestos written by mass killers.
Uh-huh.
So the Columbine kids and Ted Kaczynski's book is in there. There's this one guy, Dmitry Vinogradov. It's 2012 in Russia. And I think I wrote about this in the book. And his all of these mass killers, they write these like very kind of holy prophetic books.
Hmm.
Their goals are incredibly lofty. They're trying to send a message. They're trying to make some kind of change. Like there's something that they see as like fundamentally wrong with the human condition, and they're seeing themselves as this like divine agent of whatever, right? Of
Hmm.
like they don't use traditional theological terms, but like they are thinking theologically. And for all intents and purposes, those are religious acts. Those are holy wars. And I think that all violence itself is pretty religious. There's no act of violence that is like lacking in some kind of religious element. And I think that, by extension, it's all linguistic. You can interpret it, you can interpret the meaning of all of it very clearly. And what I'm concerned about is that our society, I don't know what's going on where we're like nerfing ourselves to the point where we won't even mention the names of mass killers anymore. And I find that to be a huge problem because we're no longer really talking about who these people are. We're not talking
Hmm.
about their childhoods. We're not discussing what might have led them to this point. There's this great author. Her name is Alice Miller, and she wrote a book called For Your Own Good, and she psychoanalyzes the Third Reich. And she's a Polish Jew, I believe, and she psychoanalyzes Hitler and talks about his childhood and his father's childhood and what stuff basically, and like also like the whole kind of milieu of Germany at the time. And in the end, Hitler's no less of a monster, but he's a monster that is like it's there's a structural component to someone like Hitler. There's a structural component to violence. Violence is not some random thing that crops up. It's not arbitrary. And I think that if we're thinking of violence as arbitrary and unspeakable and inhuman
Mm.
and animalistic, then we're really failing to understand what it is, and we're going to fail to see it coming next time.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's interesting, and this may be related, it may be unrelated, but along the same lines. Also might just be like YouTube algorithms and stuff like that. But like you'll find people are even unwilling to say certain terms. You know, for instance, like rape,
Yeah, you can't say
suicide.
it.
They have
Yeah.
they have different words. They bleep them out. Um, and yeah, I'm not sure exactly what that um, what that really achieves. But then also, yeah, what's the negative effects of refraining from engaging with those ideas?
Yeah, well, you lose specificity for sure. And we've been losing specificity with terms of violence, I think, for a while. People describe war as murder when warfare is like a different kind of killing. There are so many degrees of killing that to just say that taking a human life is murder, like full stop, you're
Hmm.
already kind of blunting, and people have been doing that for a while. So to some extent, this is sort of self-induced. And yeah, but like anytime you lose specificity in language, like I don't, is this precedented? Like, have we ever gone backwards in language? Maybe, maybe there's an example of like the fall of the Roman Empire where like did Latin sort of get did meaning get lost? Because
Sure.
in in day-to-day conversations, I find that I'm able to be very lucid, but if I'm making a YouTube video from listening to a video essay, I find it very vague. It's very hard to kind of grasp, like, okay, was this a murder or was it a manslaughter? Like, which one is it, right? It's kind of difficult to
Yeah.
know what people are talking about now. So it's almost like the global language of English, which is like communicated through mass media, which is like highly censored now, is like really nerfed. And you have these kind of like regional dialects that are very specific. And the regional dialects are having a harder time speaking to each other now because um, we use this like mass medium platform to communicate with each other. We completely lose the meaning of everything now. So it might be a dialect splitting happening. Right now. I'm not sure, but
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't want to get into too much epistemology here, but I think I'd like to sort of dive into the idea of language more broadly so that we can understand
yeah.
how violence plays into. Um, and so, one of the things that sort of impresses me about language is it's fairly difficult to understand, especially when language can manifest itself differently depending on the medium, depending on well, a lot of things. But I think a couple of things that are important is that language exists in a format. So it could be a word spoken, it could be a word written, it could be a gesture, it could be something completely separate, and that thing is separate from what it is communicating. That is to say, my word for car, it could be different than someone else's word for car. The car remains the same. The words are different, but the same idea is communicated. And then there's often a a third element of it, which is the person that is receiving the information. And if everything goes well, that concept gets moved from the one person to the other. So I'm, and that's very simplified, and obviously it's a contentious idea anyway. But how do you see sort of those elements being played out with violence?
Uh, well, I think that there are some languages that would disagree with your analysis of what with the relationship between words and concepts. I think in English it's generally agreed, and even in general, Indo-Aryan languages tend to differentiate words from concepts. It's almost like if you say chair, you say chair. Chair is a word, and then there is the physical chair that you point to, right? And it seems as though Indo-Aryan languages differentiate those things. Now, I'm not sure Semitic languages do, at least at the origin. So, for example, there's this Hebrew word is devar, which typically means word. So, Devarim is the name of Deuteronomy in the Torah. Devarim means words. Uh, it can also mean matters, or things. So, davar can mean signifier or signified,
Hmm.
and which indicates to me that originally davar, that the signifier and the signified were the same thing. Right? So the very idea of a chair is the word chair. It's all the same
Sure,
thing.
sure,
And this is why you have magic inscriptions, right? When you write a word down, it has a magical property to it because not only is the word referring to something, but it is the thing literally right there. And another example of this is Chinese characters. Um, the Oracle bone records from the Shang Dynasty, they would write these characters down as though the characters were the things themselves. And this continued on to Chinese nameplates up until recently too, where when you put somebody's name on a nameplate, well, it's believed that by putting their name there, you have the characters are the embodiment of that person. It's like a segment of their soul. And so I don't think that there's like agreement across the languages. There seem to be different sort of branches of languages that have like all sort of they kind of all have their political angles as to what language means.
Yeah.
And like
Well,
Chinese
to
has a
even
very different kind of angle on that.
to corroborate that, and it's been a while, so I don't have the specifics, but there is a Platonic dialogue that talks about that same thing, where Plato gets into, well, Socrates gets into the sort of like the primeval language, like the first language, where and in the context of his theory of forms, this kind of makes a lot of sense, where the word is the perfect word for the thing. So like
Right.
as it came down from from the gods or wherever it came down from the good, um, it is those two things are almost inextricable. And then through various corruptions and stuff like that, our words became much less so. But there does seem to be even in antiquity some corroboration for that idea that the word has some ontological significance
Yeah.
with the thing. But I mean, even languages that are not human per se, like DNA, for instance, you have a code of various amino acids that gets
Right.
through whatever process I don't understand,
Right.
but that gets interpreted and then turns into a thing,
Right.
a physical, tangible
Right.
thing. Well,
Huh.
regardless of,
And those things we might actually be more accepting of those things today than we used to be, right? Like Down syndrome, for example, or birth defects. Whereas before, those DNA combinations that produced a birth defect might have rendered that person inhuman or a monster. We don't do that anymore. So even the way that we interpret DNA now, that language, we just read it differently than we used to.
yeah. So when you're calling violence a language, what what is the range, the syntactic range, if you would, of things that could be communicated?
Okay, I'm just going to jump to the origin and say that, it's possible that at the beginning of mankind, whatever that looks like, that violence and language and kinship were all the same thing. I think that it's only through kind of the dialectic and the linguistic process that you get a differentiation between religion and language and politics, right? These things were not always separated. They were always sort of the same thing, all in one. I think at the beginning, violence and language and kinship and violence and culture, we could say, right? Were probably so interconnected that they were almost just treated as one. Like the vendetta in kinship, like the vendetta now is murder.
Mm-hmm.
That's murder now. But back then it was justice. It was payment.
Yeah.
It was like the economy, right? Like the medium of exchange in the vendetta is blood.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah, it
yeah,
definitely resonates with Genesis. There's a lot of that in
yeah,
Genesis, where presumably a very early account, by all means, um, where there seems to be very blurred lines between what people are doing to each other, to animals,
yeah,
and even what they're experiencing, communication with God. Um, yeah, it doesn't seem like it's as cut and dry as it
yeah,
is later on.
yeah, yeah,
Cain and Abel, for instance, Abraham's sacrifice in chapter 15, I think. Um, there's even like I've heard people that believe that um, Abraham's hearing the voice of God in his head or wherever he was hearing it was actually sort of indistinguishable from his interior monologue.
yeah,
Um, and
yeah,
that all kind of just like, yeah, it just all kind of bleeds together.
yeah. I mean, or like inheritance of land through marriage, right? Like if that was like if that was an inheritance through marriage story, like that would be like that would definitely be seen as the same thing as though it's being given by God, right? So
Sure.
I think that when we read, especially when you're reading Genesis, like it's why I think that's why like you have to read that book the most because you have to like you can't retcon that stuff because it's so hard to use our language to understand
Hmm.
Genesis. It's so hard, man. Like even the Ten Commandments are very difficult to understand in English. Where, if, for example, there's a lot of debate about, thou shalt not kill, right? Like some people say it's uniformly don't kill anybody, and then, on the right they'll say like, well, it's don't murder, right? But like capital punishment's okay. And actually, like the truth of the matter is way less clear than that because the verb is ratzach, which is to slay, and slay has doesn't have a normative meaning to it. Slay is a term of vengeance, and it's the same term that's used in the city of refuge laws that say that if you accidentally slay a man, then you can go to a city of refuge, and the blood avenger can't get you. Presumably, he can if you come out, right?
Right.
But like if you're innocent and you're in there, you're innocent of murder, which they don't call it murder, they call it intentional manslaughter, right? It's like intentional homicide versus unintentional homicide. And but if he is actually guilty of slaying, then you are to slay the slayer. So there's nothing normative about the verb to slay. And so in the Ten Commandments, when it says thou shalt not kill, it says thou shalt not slay. But like there's clearly a huge caveat to this because it says in Numbers 30 that you are to slay in a certain situation. So
Mm.
like thou shalt not slay is like a very sort of like annotated version of like don't slay somebody if they've unintentionally slayed somebody.
Yeah.
So, to even try and think like the way that they did back then, which is, it could have been 1000 BC, could have been longer ago than that. These stories are very old. Um, it's very hard for us today because we really have like separated everything out into these categories that I think like are not they don't have to be separated. I think if we start thinking of these categories as the same thing again, that we could actually gain a little bit of insight into how people used to think.
Yeah. Well, I think before we turned the recording on, we were talking about sort of some of the consequences of modernism and the way that we look at the world. And one of the things that modernists, the empiricists, or just us, we really like to classify. We like to delineate, and we like to set things in separate categories. And I think it's really just a symptom of wanting to control things. The more we understand, the more we can classify and order everything conceptually or otherwise, the more we feel like we're in control. And I think one of the unfortunate consequences of that is that we get these often arbitrary lines between concepts, where there it may not be as clear cut as we think it is. And so just starting to think about how I would go about thinking about religion, politics, and violence and language, or whatever, how I would go about trying to meld those back together is exceedingly difficult.
Yeah, I mean, the best we can kind of do is etymology. It's a good place to start.
Yeah.
I mean, this is like why I wholeheartedly reject the de Saussurean idea that like words are just arbitrary, symbols that point to things that we decide that we agree on, right? It's like, well, every word has etymology. Everything can be traced back to the beginning. I don't think anything is ever arbitrary. And I think that as soon as we believe that things are just arbitrary and based on agreement, then we kind of lose track of, the fact that things have become, uh, like you said, more categorized over time. And I don't think that, expanding categories is necessarily bad. I think that in general, that can be good as we understand that the planets and the stars sort of operate a little bit differently than we thought they used to. Um, they're different entities now. The sun and the moon were once believed to be like both light sources, right? And so there is some value to like empirical specificity, but in general, I think you're right that we're trying to control our environment. Um, and when it comes to, when it comes to trying to get back to what language and violence have in common, I really do think that kinship is like one of the bridging features there. That without understanding kinship and how ancient kinship works, and even just like questioning our own kinship and our alliances, and how quickly our lives just completely change the minute our kinship changes. Like our religious beliefs will change on a dime if our kinship system changes. And it seems to me like there is this sort of like a tree diagram, you could say, where violence and culture were all the same thing at one point, and then the violence and maybe kinship split first, and then kinship and language split, or kinship and religion split. And then over time, we've sort of gotten better at identifying the pieces, but we've forgotten that they may have come from the same place.
Hmm. Well, first, I guess I wonder what, so sort of what needs to happen to make something like this idea track
Hmm.
in the mainstream. Like, what
Yeah.
is it that's preventing us
Yeah.
from going in that direction?
First thing that came to mind regarding the mainstream, um, the the reason AI has the reason AI is successful to the extent that it is right now is because they realized how kind of pointless it was to even try and make a linguistic model of language. Instead, what they did was they just threw a ton of data at it and just made an autocomplete system, right? And what that does, I think, is it sort of it's created this bias. And I actually don't think that that's where the bias comes from. There's been this bias against understanding violence for quite some time. And I don't quite know where it comes from, but I think, if I were to start somewhere, I would start by trying to work with an LLM to parse violence so that it can be understood as more of a language. I don't think you could ever fully parse a gunshot, for example. Like if you were to put a video of a robbery in front of an
Sure.
LLM, right? And you were just to break down every frame and you were to like annotate, like he means to do this guy means to do this, okay, now this happens, so now he's meaning to do that, he's planning for this thing based on this gesture. There's a million things that you could do you would never finish, but you would at least lend some specificity to violence that is like not there right now. And I think that's one of the reasons LLMs can't recreate violence right now. They can make a video of Socrates doing an hour-long monologue perfectly in Greek, but they can't render a punch. It's the strangest thing. And this is supposedly one of our basest behaviors that it can't replicate. I find that very strange.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, when you were talking about the scene of a bank robbery or just whatever kind of you can go online, you can watch people getting shot in Philadelphia or whatever, like it doesn't really whatever. um it would seem to me that there's one person that has an objective. Anything could happen, right? I mean, I'm just giving this example, right?
Hmm.
One person has an objective. I want to steal this thing. I want to kill this person. Whatever. But it seems like everyone else in those situations has a very clear objective. I don't want to die. You know what I mean? Like, so if that's at least half of it, right? Could that possibly be useful in sort of like anchoring these ideas to a concept that sort of is pretty ubiquitous?
I don't know if LLMs, for example, can even simulate that though,
Hmm.
because an LLM, like it's hard enough to act it, right? Because part of my job is acting like I'm dying. So when I do motion capture, I'll do gameplay movements for characters that you kill on a battlefield, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes it's very theatrical. They want you to spin so that they can have the blood fly out, or they want you to
Yeah.
grab your stomach because your guts are falling out.
Organs are, yeah. Okay.
Yeah, or like whatever, or like the head gets cut off, and I'll say, oh, so does he die right away? Does he kind of walk around looking for his head? Like, how funny do you want it to be? And I've done shoots before where like I was doing so many death animations that I started kind of going into the well of like real deaths I had seen on online. And I don't seek these out, by the way. Like I
Mm,
don't seek out people dying, but I'm sure a lot of us have accidentally come across some kind of horrific, faces of death moment. Faces of
mm,
Death was an actual VHS you could rent at a video store with like this stuff once upon a time. And and I ended up like kind of going into this dark spot where I was acting like somebody who didn't want to die. And that's really terrifying because you start thinking about your plans, and like, you're going to see your kids tonight and oh, that's not happening now. And you have a
yeah.
few seconds to deal with that. And and those performances were actually very good. And they were very telling. It was like I could tell a story of death in 3 seconds. So
Mm,
even death has this like storytelling aspect to it. But um, yeah, how do you convey? It's like it's very difficult to convey that with language. So part of what I've done is I've I've worked at like making a sort of uh, lexicon of movement and of violence, and that helps us just like get through a motion capture shoot for a game, for example. But it also helps us to like parse what part of the movement needs to be fixed. It's very easy to communicate like, okay, when you held the gun, um, the anticipation of going into holding the gun was like a little bit too certain, right? You need to be less certain about the anticipation into the gun. And so the more we could kind of like break up violence into these pieces and kind of build it like a sentence, then I think like the more we're able to actually see it coming.
mm,
We're able to see that in people, and that's all martial arts is supposed to do, in my opinion. Like I've taught martial arts, and the good martial arts teachers were the ones who would do moves very slowly, and they would teach you how to do the move very slowly. So like my Hapkido teacher, Dennis Rule, who just died recently, he his technique was very slow. It was never like traumatic. He was never trying to build like fast twitch, like just when you get grabbed, just act. He never taught that. He always taught like, okay, where I'm gonna grab. Okay, so now this joint doesn't like going that way. Why don't you try pushing it with a good tap? And he would do like that, and we would do it very slowly, and it was like time would slow down. And I think that saved my life because I talk about it in the book. 2014, we were shooting a movie, and I got robbed at gunpoint, and a kid pointed a gun at me. He was like this. He was scared out of his mind. He was looking at my chest. He was scared out of his mind, and there were a couple of like Steven Seagal ideas in my head, like, oh, I could grab him like this and pin him to the ground and drop a knee on his elbow, or I could go this side and pop him in the face and disarm. And I just like stayed there and didn't move because I was allowed to just think through that stuff without the fast twitch response.
right.
And I think it saved my life being able to think through violence. And it made it
Right.
unemotional.
Well, and I think the way that you're explaining it too sort of expands that syntactic range. Like, sure, there's the pulling of the trigger, but the way you explain it, there's a whole story in what leads up to that moment. Like, there's intention, but then there's like this counter intention. This guy didn't want to shoot you; he just wanted your camera equipment or whatever it
Yeah.
was he wanted.
Yeah.
But like
Yeah.
he realized like, okay, there's a way to get this, which is posturing or threatening or being prepared to or whatever. And the reality was the gun even loaded. Do we know this? Like
Right.
so many of these questions that you're right have so much um, language in it, so much, if not language, so much information.
Yeah.
Um, that's really interesting. Yeah.
So when you asked earlier about, the kind of we're talking about the difference between language and violence. I mean, this is it's a little bit confusing to think about it, but I kind of think of the two things as just using the same plumbing. One is the hot water and one is the cold water. And there's this plumbing system that we have that's very unique to us. Only we're the only ones that have this. We can turn on the hot water or we can turn on the cold water, and it'll just go one way or the other.
Mm.
And we want the cold water on as much as possible. I mean, it's not the greatest analogy, but you get what I'm
Yeah.
saying, right? We don't
Yeah.
want the violence to blow up. We want it to always go into deferral and into culture.
Yeah, well, and I think the way you're explaining that also sort of helps to sort of understand, I think, what you're getting at with the idea of language and violence, which is that, to say how is violence a language is already making a distinction between
Yeah.
those two things. Where if you say, okay, like violence is language,
Yeah.
then it doesn't become a matter of like fitting it into that
Yeah.
peg or
Yeah.
into that hole. Rather, it's just sort of interpreting it
Yeah.
as such. And
Yeah.
I think that's probably more along the lines of
It-
what you're getting at.
yeah, I mean, this is like a really tough pill for most people to swallow because most people don't like thinking about violence. And like the way I tried to lay it out in the book is that the way that the way that your brain starts working in any kind of violent situation, even when you're just thinking about high crime. You just think about high crime. You got your family, you've got your home, you're thinking about the alarm system, you have a gun, is there a lock on it, how long is it going to take, all these things, right?
Yeah.
There's a million things, and you almost get overwhelmed just even starting to think about it. And so, what that does, so if you just imagine two people, let's imagine two people who are on opposite sides of a mountain. um, You're on one side, I'm on the other side. There's there's a carcass on the top of this mountain, and I want that carcass, and you want that carcass, and really only one of us can have it because we hate each other. Let's just say that. And when we get there, or even before we get there, we're sort of thinking about the same situation, and we may not even see each other yet. But if you know that I'm on the other side and I know you're on the other side, you know that I can make weapons or I just have stones. I know that you have weapons, you have stones. It's all you need. I know you have cousins, you know I have cousins.
Mm.
We're already playing tactics before we even see each other, right? This is the chessboard with the generals, right? You don't even see the enemy, and ideally you never do, but you're planning out thousands of moves in advance, or really eight maximum as a person if you don't have writing. You can tell people and offload it that way, but at any rate, what we're doing is we're sort of like we have our own kind of windows into the apocalypse, right? And both of us sort of agree that it would be best for nothing to happen, right? It would be best if, well, it'd be best if you just back down and I could have the carcass, right?
Right.
And for you, it'd be best if I back down and you had the carcass. Unfortunately, that will also kill us. So when we get up there, there's going to be a moment of reckoning where you're standing across from it with your people and I'm standing across from it with my people. And this is what Eric Gans calls the originary scene. And what Eric Gans proposes that there's this originary sign of deferral that we all sort of agree to, right? It's this aborted gesture of appropriation where we all have some kind of sign which defers violence and allows us to separate the meat up, and it's the first sacrifice, right? That's kind of the idea behind the originary hypothesis. And my update to that is that, you know, it's not so much that we just agree on the sign, it's that the very like kind of tunnel vision into the apocalypse that both of us have when we're around this carcass, right? Where we're both seeing that conflict is necessary, but totally unwanted. Like we just do not
Mm-hmm.
want this. We both
Right.
see the apocalyptic potential for this because if one of us goes down, there's going to be a vengeance campaign, there's going to be a feud, and more than likely, like even if you win, there are going to be people coming for your kids and your women and vice versa, right?
Right.
Nobody really wants it to go there, and so we actually agree, right? We almost have like the same perspective in a sense. It's slightly different because yours is on that side, mine is on this side, but
Yeah.
at least we're kind of like angling toward the same thing. And if we just kind of like put those two on top of each other, that is our first sign. And that sign represents both of these things, both your perspective and mine. If that's a word, I don't know if it's a gesture, whatever it is, but my belief is that words are those like infinitely deep overlaid windows into the apocalypse.
Huh.
Except words are like very advanced now. It's like very difficult to find
Right.
violence within
Yeah.
words.
Sure.
But I mean,
But
like,
you're saying like sort of the progenitors of the words that we have.
yeah, and like, one of my harebrained theories is that if we all had rocks, right? I think that that would be the most likely candidate for the first weapon. If we all have rocks, well, there would be here's one good way to show that I don't want to use this. There's one good way to do it is to actually
Put it down.
break it or put it down, but I
Okay.
mean actually break it and turn it into a symbol of a broken rock that is like not wieldable anymore.
Yeah.
And I think I think that it's possible that the first words were these unwieldable rocks, and I think they look like this. I think they look like this.
Like sharp on all ends.
Yes. So
Okay.
this is an Acheulean hand axe. They call them hand axes. I don't think it was a hand axe because you can't hold this. I don't understand where this idea comes from. Like if you use tools, there's nowhere to put your hand on this thing without cutting yourself. I don't know how that could be a hand axe. Seems to me that these were possibly, possibly signs of rendering a rock unwieldable.
Huh.
Right? That would just be one example of like
Yeah. No.
how this, when you look at this as a person, you're like, oh, there's a man who doesn't want to throw a rock at me. Just as an example, right? That could be a word that immediately connotes deferral of violence. And then over time, I don't know, maybe the stroke order became cuneiform, became Chinese characters. I don't know.
Sure.
But that kind of thing is just one
Yeah.
example of how like a symbol can be, a direct sort of descendant of violence.
Well, I just wanted to go in a slightly different direction
Sure.
because one of the things that I hope to do more of is just talk to people who have gone through the process of writing books, sort of about the nuts and bolts
Yeah.
and the processes. So, um, just regarding the, do you have something that you're working on right now, by the way?
Yeah.
How far
Yeah.
along are you?
85 pages into another book, and
Okay.
writing a few at the same time now.
Okay.
Because, yeah.
So what did your writing process look like for this? Did you have a certain amount, like a set time each day that you'd work on it, a certain amount of time, or where you do a word count that you tried to accomplish?
Well, since it was my first book, I think I was just trying to figure out like what my subject was, and I think anybody who writes their first book is, well, at least in my case, it's going to be kind of a theory of everything, and then your books after that are going to be like, you're taking a chapter and you're turning that into a book, right?
Yeah.
And that's sort of what I'm doing now. So my first book, my main thing is I wanted to home in on this theory of violence. And um, first one, I probably I printed out like a very kind of rough version and just printed it on Amazon Kindle Direct. Just printed it so that I could have it and look at it. And I gave
Hmm.
out like 5 or 6 copies for people to review. All of them read it, all of them gave feedback, and then I went back, and then I sort of like sat on it for a few months. But that book took me a month. That was like 80 pages. That was like a super book on everything.
Okay.
Um, and then cut out 80% of it, and took 20% and kind of like rolled it around in my head to try and find a way to turn it into a story because the thing that people really responded to in the first draft was the storytelling. And if you can connect a story, like a story thread, into it, and I decided that the book would be about kind of the creation of kind of an autobiography of my career. If I could tell the theory as that arc of my career, so a lot of it was trying to just like shape that piece, and then I would outline. I did some presentations, and then I did a talk in Mexico City at a Rene Girard conference, colloquium on violence and religion. And I, after I did that, I sort of had the book, and I went and I wrote an outline on the plane, and then it took me about 3 months, I think,
Okay.
of fairly regular writing, pretty almost daily. um, and
And
that
you had obviously done a lot of the research prior, like you had all your
yeah, the research
resources
was pretty
kind
much
of
always done,
compiled.
already done. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
And
yeah.
um, again, sort of, in the weeds here, but like, what? So two separate questions. What uh, tools did you use for writing? I imagine you typed it somehow. And then also, what did you outsource?
I wrote it in Word. I'm not good at outlining. I'm just not. When I say I wrote an outline, like when I write an outline, it's like 3 lines, and then I just start filling it in. I'm really
Hmm.
bad at outlining. Some people are good at it. Do what you're gonna do. I've just never been good at it. I kind of like think through. I can kind of like see the whole story. That's how I outline. I don't write it
Yeah.
down. Once I see the whole story, I just start writing, and that's what I started doing with my latest book. And it's I don't even try to outline it anymore. I kind of just know where it's going.
Yeah, I don't do much outlining myself. But I take it. I mean, well, I know just because I read in the front cover, you hired out the
Yep.
cover. Did
Yep.
you have someone format it for you, or did you do your own formatting?
I did my own formatting.
It looks really good.
Thanks.
What did you use? You did it
Word.
in Word?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow. That's impressive. Did that take a long time?
No.
Huh.
The formatting? No.
Yeah, yeah. Just like once you had it all written out, because I mean, obviously there's pictures, QR codes, different fonts,
No. Uh,
chapter breaks, page breaks.
the uh, the thing I kind of wrestled with was the footnotes. I don't really like
Mm.
the way the footnotes are done in it, but it was like the best option that Word could provide. But I have a different way I'm going to approach it next time.
Okay. Would you have them on the bottom of not on the bottom, in the back?
Yeah, I would basically do a more yeah, I would do a footnote number, put it on the bottom with like last name, year, page number, and then there would be a bibliography in the back that would list all that. That's
Okay.
my plan for that. Um,
Okay. Yeah, and did you have an editor for this?
yeah, I hired an editor.
Okay.
That was very helpful. He was very critical. He helped also with tone and consistency, like tense consistency also.
Oh yeah, yeah.
It's really important.
Yeah.
I tended to start drifting into present tense when I write.
Hmm.
Uh,
Yeah, I've only worked with an editor for fiction, but I imagine it'd be equally helpful for nonfiction.
yeah, my poor editor, like he didn't know it was nonfiction, so he charged me as like fiction rate. He was like,
Oh,
"Hey,
okay.
I didn't know this is nonfiction. I'm gonna stick to my rate, but just so you know, like I charge a lot more for nonfiction." Yeah, that's fair.
Oh, really? It's more
Yeah.
expensive. Well,
Yeah.
I guess there's probably uh, a little less creative license that you can default to if you're doing nonfiction. The editor's got to be a
Yeah.
little more stringent, I
Yeah.
guess.
Yeah.
And then
Um,
you published on Amazon, right? That was
yeah.
your,
Yeah.
and then you did their print on demand, everything like
Yeah.
that.
It's great.
You like work with them?
Yeah, it's easy. Yeah, it's really easy.
Sweet.
I did a Kindle version also. That was really easy. You just download the app, you put your Word doc into it, and reformat in Kindle, and that's done. You could
Yeah,
do the entire thing in like 2 hours. It's so
yeah,
easy. Yeah,
yeah.
is that how you
Amazon.
did it?
Yeah,
Yeah,
I worked through them. A little bit of a initial learning curve, just getting like mostly with the formatting and the cover and everything. But yeah, the second one was much easier than the first. Um, do you do any marketing for the book? I mean, obviously, like you do interviews and stuff, but any advertising or anything like that?
no advertising. Um, I'm terrible at marketing. I have a publicist, and I've been telling him like my main target is podcasts. Um, and I'm very much a you just need one pair of eyeballs to see your work to get the next thing.
Yeah,
I'm not trying to sell millions of copies. But nice as that would be, that's not my goal. Like if that's your goal, then that is this marketing path. But if you just want to get somebody's attention so that you get hired as a consultant, for example, then you just need to get on like
yeah,
one podcast with 500 viewers, like a local podcast maybe. Your local entrepreneurs listen to this podcast, you get on there and you say something that you know that they want to hear and you're targeting it to them,
hmm
then like you might hear from some of them. That's been my my sort of angle.
Yeah, yeah, that's interesting. It's a. I mean, I'm sure even if you've just researched it at all, it's like a mire of like all the different advice that you'll get on marketing, and
Yeah,
you can spend unlimited amount of money
yeah,
um, doing that sort of thing, and it's definitely a it's tenuous ground for sure.
yeah, yeah. And
But
I went with self-publishing too, just because I don't know the publishing business.
right,
I'm sure I could have gotten it to somebody, and maybe they would have picked it up, and maybe paid a little bit for it. Probably not, and then it would still probably be going through,
right, exactly.
review.
And and you've got a pretty sizable YouTube, um, right? Couple hundred thousand. Is that
Yeah,
correct?
190, almost 200,000 now.
Okay. Have you found that to be a resource for the books or not really?
No, no,
Yeah,
the algorithm has no idea how to show that stuff to them,
yeah.
which I get.
That's
Like,
that's I found the same thing. Like my channel's not quite so large, but anytime I want to do something that's outside, sort of,
yeah,
even this probably to be honest, but that's kind of outside what I had originally set out to do. It just you know
yeah, it
it
hates it.
doesn't get traction.
Yeah. I mean, there was a few years ago when I closed all my social media accounts except YouTube, and I wanted to like rebrand to kind of do stuff like this, where it's much headier and much more philosophical, and and I, it kind of works, but in general, though, like if you're playing to the algorithm, yeah, you should just do one thing.
Yeah, well, that's I even tried once I published my first book. I wanted to change the YouTube name. The current name is 60 Second Philosophy. I just wanted to put my name on there,
Right.
and I did for about 2 months, and just numbers just went, they
Yeah.
plummeted.
Huh.
Um, and so I'll probably do that to be honest at this point because like I don't care at this point.
Yeah.
But yeah, while I was still, in YouTube's good graces, it wasn't worth attempting.
It's it sucks. I mean, I did a podcast on my channel, which was like very relevant, right? It's an action podcast. I was interviewing action stars, choreographers, directors, stunt performers, and these are like 2 hour episodes with a ton of reference video, and we'd go super deep on stuff. And even that, man, YouTube is just like, nah, you've got this Star Wars and Tekken stuff. So where's all that? Everyone's coming here for that. And it's like, and even it was crazy because like the first few episodes of the podcast that I did, it was like 5,000 views, 8,000 views, 10,000 views. Oh, okay, this is good. This is not viral, but it's something. And then
Right.
it started going down to 5,000 and 3,000 and 2,000 and then like 300.
Really?
And I was just like, I just don't, I don't want to play this. So I just don't take that angle. I think some people may have like an algorithm intuition and like they can do that stuff, but I'm of the opinion like put it on there and then send it to contacts who do your slow campaign where you send it to important people and get them interested in it and try and talk to them about it and talk ideas and see what comes of that. And that's the angle I'm taking.
Yeah. Yeah. It's definitely frustrating, trying to predict the algorithm or trying or even just trying to placate the algorithm.
Yeah.
Um, and yeah, I've kind of come along to the same position. Like, it's just not worth it. Just do what you're gonna do and find a way to make it.
Yeah.
Find a way to get eyeballs on it.
Yeah.
So yeah, yeah, that's good. I like getting other people's sort of you know behind the curtain on the writing process because it's very different for everybody. And so you said you have multiple irons in the fire. Sort of what
Yeah.
if you want to just briefly go through maybe what you're
Yeah,
working on
sure.
now.
One of them is movement language, and that's a chapter in the book where uh, I I break down sort of the process that I came up with to describe movement as a language. And there's a whole lot to that, right? That's like it's my analysis of how you can transform violence into you can put a grammar to it, and I use that when I'm doing motion capture, and it actually has like a syntax and a flow to it. When you look at certain kinds of action cinema, like American action cinema versus Japanese versus Hong Kong
Yeah,
action cinema, there's this cadence and rhythm to the action that's actually like there's a correlation with the language. And so that to me is fascinating. And that was one of the things that actually made me write the first book. But now I just want to write a book entirely about that. Um, Another one is a fiction. Right now it's called We See You, David Fringe. And it's a sci-fi about an anthropologist. He's like more of like a psychiatrist. He gets hired to investigate what seems like a werewolf occurrence on a space station, and he goes up there to investigate that. And so there's a whole lot of stuff in there about exorcism, possession, um, domestication, and like the threats of AI, that kind of thing.
that's cool.
Yeah, that one's a lot of
Yeah,
that one's really fun to write.
yeah. I've always, I mean, my personal process, I try, so far so good, to rotate fiction, nonfiction, because it's just a totally different experience
Yeah.
writing fiction than it is writing nonfiction. I think both of them are quite a lot of fun actually. Um, but yeah, it's good to be able to do both.
What are your what are some of your fiction inspirations?
I so honestly, like a lot of the stuff that I like is not the stuff that I write. Um, and for me, it's kind of like the ideas are sort of central. So I'll
Mm,
pick like um, I'll have just a big idea um, that I kind of want to package in a way that people can kind of digest. And so a lot of it comes from Plato. Um, but recently, everything I've written has kind of linked back to Genesis.
hmm
So the sci-fi book that I wrote was basically uh, basically a recapitulation of Genesis 1 through 12. Um, and then I wrote a book on Genesis, and then the book I'm publishing this September has sort of themes of Paradise Lost,
cool.
which is like Genesis light,
Yeah.
and so that's been kind of what I'm on right now, but it's subject to change, I guess.
Have you read Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance?
No.
Oh my gosh, I mean, it's this guy's, it's like a road motorcycle autobiography with Plato involved.
Interesting. Let
Oh
me.
yeah, I think you would love it. Yeah, that's a great one.
Yeah, I'm gonna look. I'm gonna bring this up right now so I can. Huh. That's cool.
Yeah.
Nice. Keep that bookmarked here.
Yeah, it's a good one.
All
Um,
right.
yeah.
Well, I should probably get wrapping up.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for joining. I hope that we can do this again, maybe when you publish your next book.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Uh, what's your time frame, you think?
I would like to finish this draft up by end of August, get it out for
Nice.
review, and um, I don't know, publish it in the fall, hopefully. That'd be nice.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's great. That's an ambitious timeline too. I finished my last draft in May, and I'm pushing for September, but we'll see.
How many pages?
It's I don't know. I don't go by pages. It's just over 50,000 words, so it's fairly short.
It's cool.
But yeah, it's good. So yeah, hopefully stay in touch. Let me know when it's out, and
Yeah,
or
we'll do.
when you're if you're looking for a review copy or something. I'd love to take a look.
All right, you're on.
Sweet,
I'll send you
cool,
one.
nice. All right, so